Okay, fantastic. Welcome everyone to the Riverland Academy of Clinical Excellence Grand Rounds. I'm Amy Mendham and I'm a senior researcher within RACE. And firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which I'm sitting on today, where I'm in Berry in the Riverland on Erewhon country. And I'd like to pay my respects for the elders past, present and emerging. And I extend my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So we've got a really nice guest here to talk to us today, Dr. Bruce Neal, who's the Executive Director of the George Institute, and he'll be talking to us about collaborating for success on clinical trials. So Bruce, take it away. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, lovely to meet you too. And thanks again very much for the opportunity, which is, as I said, when we were chatting just prior to this presentation, came from a meeting that I had with Paul at an Australian teletrials meeting a few months ago. And we were chatting about some of the challenges and opportunities to doing clinical trials. And he invited me to talk to your group. He suggested that I talked about some of the things that we'd been doing at the George Institute, what I thought was successful, what I thought was perhaps less successful, and I'm really keen to hear from you at the end of this presentation, if you're willing to take the time, a little bit about what you think about some of the comments that I've made. So anyway, I'll kick off just by telling you very briefly about myself. So I'm originally a UK trained physician. I worked in the health service for about 5 years in the UK before taking up a full-time research career about 25 years ago. And I've spent most of my career, or most of the first 15 years, doing sort of large-scale clinical trials, mostly in the cardiovascular space, but more recently have become interested in a broader set of things, and as the executive director for the George Institute in Australia, had a moderate administrative load over the last few years. But throughout, I've retained a really strong interest in clinical trial infrastructure and how we might do better. So, brief introduction about the George Institute. We're an independent medical research institute. We were established in 1999. We're based in Sydney, but we have significant offices in India and the UK, and we previously had a large office in China. We work entirely in the sort of public health clinical space, so we have no labs, just lots of desks with computers, epidemiologists, biostatisticians, clinicians, and the like, working on our projects. And our program is pretty broad, so we do a lot of clinical research, but we also do work in injuries, food policy, and a whole bunch of work around sort of how health systems function. So I'm going to narrow down and focus on the topic of clinical trials and just talk to you about how we've started doing clinical trials, how that evolved, I guess the slightly different approaches we've taken to doing commercial versus non-commercial projects, then talk about some of the features of success, and then finish with a few thoughts about how we're thinking the sector might move forward. And that, I guess, is the bit I'd be particularly interested in hearing your thoughts on, because you're obviously very successful in this space as well. So the George Institute has really benefited from doing large-scale clinical trials, and I'm going to start by talking about the original model that really enabled us to launch the institute and put the institute on the map. And that model was to identify clinical public health opportunities for doing new science, but to do that using drug therapies that still had a patent life and that big pharma companies would pay you to do the research on. And the very original models that we used, we would put together a proposal. And if I take an example, when I first started doing research, ACE inhibitors were still pretty new, exciting things, which ages me a bit. But we identified that ACE inhibitors were being used very widely in the heart failure setting, but also in the antihypertensive setting. We identified a large group of people who we thought would benefit from ACE inhibition for whom there wasn't currently an indication. We took that proposal to a number of pharmaceutical companies. One of them agreed to fund it. And we then, over the next 6 years, did a large-scale outcome trial. We did the trial pretty much entirely independently of the pharma company. They got to hear about what was going on, but we ran the science and we did all of the operations, and they provided us with a very large grant to do that. That was great because it enabled a couple of things. So first, we got a very high impact publication out of it. Second, we genuinely advanced science. We identified benefits for a very large population group that didn't previously have access to that therapy. But equally importantly, we take the view that working with companies is a really good thing for translation as well, because as many of you would know, getting science into practice is a real challenge, even very good science. But if you've got, as a partner from the get-go, an industry organization which is going to make money out of the scientific advance that you make a discovery out, then there's a very reasonable chance that it will get taken up. Not always in the way that you want it to, in that often these types of innovations get offered first to high-income settings, which isn't great for equity. But again, if you can take a longer-term view on it, and you know that ACE inhibitors are now available at low cost almost everywhere around the world. The other key advantage of this was that because it was a large grant, we were able to make margin on it, and that enabled us to do all sorts of things that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to do in terms of building the profile and capacity of the organization. We did a number of trials along that model. It went very well for us, but what we found as time progressed was that companies were unwilling to really just hand over a very large sum of money, let you get on with it, and then provide them with something 5 or 6 years later down the track. And they also started to build much more in-house capacity to actually do projects. So the model evolved whereby we were increasingly not doing the whole project, but we were still leading the science, designing the projects, providing oversight, and often running the projects in part of the world, but not in every country of the world. And as long as we laid out the terms of engagement, as long as we had clear capacity to write up the results as we saw fit based on the science, we also found this a very successful model. About a decade ago, we were doing more and more of these sorts of projects, and we ended up spinning out a company which was called George Clinical. No, that's all right.
Sorry.
So we established a spin-out company, and the reason for that in the first instance wasn't that we actually wanted to sell the company, but it was because some of the contracts were very large. There was a lot of risk associated with them, and it was a good way to compartmentalize that risk within the organization. We did ultimately, as a consequence of spinning out George Clinical, start doing even more trials, but doing them on a fee-for-service type model, whereby we had in the end no scientific interest in some of the projects that were being done by George Clinical, and they were being done purely as a way of generating an income stream that could contribute to the other goals of the organization. It was a successful model, and in the end we sold George Clinical for a large amount of money a couple of years ago to private equity in Singapore. And George Clinical at that point was a global full service clinical research organization. It used to provide us with an income stream. It now has been effectively turned into an endowment for the organization. So that's been a pretty good result for us. We didn't just do commercial trials, of course. We did a lot of academic trials. And I guess the key change that we implemented over the course of doing the academic trials was is also worth mentioning. So the organisation grew from a handful of people to being more than 1,000 people now, and at the same time it grew from having one or two research programs in particular areas to having by a decade ago 10 or 15 research programs. And because of the organic way the organisation grew, each of those research programs had its own operational team. And it became clear pretty quickly that this was actually a very inefficient and ineffective way of doing things, because each research program would have a handful of people working from an operational perspective. Projects would run out of funding, new projects would come on, there would never be enough people with the right set of skills within a particular program to service the operational needs. And so there were a lot of delays and inefficiencies. It was also not really possible within a program and with just a handful of people within a disease-specific program to have the capacity to grow, train, and really love the operational teams in the way that we needed to. So about 10 to 15 years ago, we just made the decision to just have a single operational platform within the institution, and to have the disease-specific programs effectively buy clinical trial and other research services from that single operational platform. On the whole, that's been a huge success because of the sorts of things that I've mentioned that it's enabled. It has also introduced some challenges because while we try with that program to keep particular staff working with particular programs, it's not always possible, and there can be conflicts arise whereby the operational team want to move staff from one program to another to better service the particular needs of a particular project that maybe is in startup or coming to close out, and that doesn't always go down well. But most of the time, with a bit of goodwill on each side, we're able to resolve those problems. It's been hugely important as a way of reducing staff turnover and bringing in inefficiencies that I should mention. So what do I think have been the key features of the success of our organisation from a clinical trial perspective? Well, those industry connections have been invaluable, not just because it's enabled us to do margin generating projects and generate income to support the organisation more broadly, but because it's allowed us to really do some very high impact work and to drive real translation into clinical practice. And we've made a sustained effort to ensure that we have, throughout the course of growth of the organisation, had a strong cohort of clinical researchers who are key opinion leaders, ideally not just in Australia, but globally, so that we keep connected. And we've progressed from the hypertension field, the lipid field, diabetes, kidney disease, and the like. We've also, as I think any organisation would in this setting, really focused on having a strong cohort of clinical academics doing non-commercial projects, people who are able to win the grants and attract the collaborative groups to engage with us. That's included not just strong clinicians, but also strong methodologists. But I think one of our key points of difference, and we're not perfect at it, but we have really focused not just on having people who are expert in disease and expert in scientific methodology, but having people who are expert on how do you actually deliver things. And I think that's probably a much more important reason why third-party research organizations, be they commercial or academic, come to us and still come to us and want to work with us. It's not because we know more about their particular disease area. It's because they've seen us as a group that is able to get things done and has a real focus on delivery. And in that regard, another key to our success has been the fact that we're an independent medical research institute, not a university. And I don't mean to be rude to universities. Universities are great for some things, but if you're trying to hire staff quickly, do things in a slightly different way, universities can be quite limiting because they are such big organizations. There's a degree of agility that comes with being an MRI that has been tremendously important to us. Another thing that I will just mention, I think, is quality. Quality is something that is much talked about and very difficult to get right, because what you have to do for a commercial study is different to what you have to do for an academic study. I mean, both need to be done to a certain level of quality, but commercial studies demand all sorts of, frankly, unreasonable and unnecessary things, but you nonetheless have to provide them. The other thing I think that we've learned is that you should expect to have quality issues. And frankly, if you're not picking up quality issues, you're probably not looking hard enough. And the most important thing is not to have no quality issues, but to have a really good strategy for dealing with them when they arise, such that you get different quality issues the next time, not the same ones. Finish up just with a few comments about what we think the future might look like. Australia is clearly very well recognized for the quality of its medical research, but I think it's fair to say that it's falling behind in terms of its capacity to do clinical trials. Certainly, there are frequently projects that my colleagues are doing overseas, which they would like us to do in Australia, which I'm simply not able to say that we can do in Australia. And it's pretty basic things like not having ready access to large numbers of patients who I can contact directly who might be interested in being in the project. It's not having easy access to routinely collected health data as a way of collecting outcomes for clinical trials. It's ongoing perceptions around slow, delayed governance, ethics type processes. And we've just completed a 9-month process of sort of consultation with the sector in New South Wales with the support of the New South Wales government. And I guess one of the key observations that's come out of that is that there are some important technical advances that are happening in clinical trials. Getting better at platforms, getting access to data does require a degree of technical capacity, an upgrading of technical capacity. Likewise, being able to do adaptive or introduce adaptive elements to clinical trials is clearly going to be really important for the future, and there is a bunch of capacity that needs developing in that regard. But mostly, the challenges that we face in doing clinical trials in Australia are not because we lack technical capacity. They're because we lack the capacity to operationalize things that we know we should do and to work together to achieve that. And it's only when we can do that that I think we're really going to get back to being at the top of the world in regard to our clinical trial capacity in Australia. We have to move away from the sort of endemic parochialism and competition that we have between our research organizations to a much different approach that is really based upon, I guess, ubiquitous collaboration and sharing. And that's what we're going to be working to try and achieve over the next few years. So I think come to about 20 minutes now, so I'll stop talking and I'd be very happy to answer any questions or to hear commentary about those thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. That was very interesting. I've made lots of notes and I have a couple of questions. And it's around the national data linkage. And that's a problem because of competition and individuals working solely in their own space, or is it more of a national innovation technology problem?
So I think I think the core of the problem is probably around privacy and privacy regulations, and the slightly over the top approach that Australia has had to that over the last 10 or so years. I mean, clearly medical data is highly sensitive and it needs to be appropriately protected. But the privacy regulations and their interpretation of them is often pretty extreme. So, for example, we were trying to recruit people in primary care, and we knew that it's always a challenge. Maybe you guys are much better at it. Probably you are, but we had a model which was reasonably successful, whereby we would engage primary care practices, and we would then provide support to the primary care practices by either providing online access to a data analyst or someone who could help with the primary care software in identifying and getting invitations ready for potential participants. We'd done that for several years, and then we came across a particular ethics committee which said, oh no, you can't do that because the people might see the name of an individual or a characteristic of an individual as part of that process. Therefore, we'll put a stop to it. And we had to stop doing the whole project pretty much, and it was pretty much impossible for us to recruit in primary care as a consequence. We appealed it back to the ethics committee, to the privacy commissioner, and eventually they went, yeah, no, that's mad. You should be able to do that. So there's that. There's the fact that the take on that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and by jurisdiction it could be health district, primary healthcare network, ethics committee, state, territory, government. In New South Wales, there are ways to get access to routinely collected health data that could be used to record outcomes for clinical trials, but they're really complicated, and we still don't have a consolidated, streamlined approach that can provide the sort of real-time access that you need if you're going to use those data for clinical trial outcomes.
So if we were to look at an ideal case study on an international platform, are we looking at what America does, what the UK does? What would you see to be?
Yeah, I think probably the leaders in this are some of the Scandinavian countries. So you go to Sweden, Denmark, places like that. They've really got this organised. I think the UK is getting pretty good at this as well. Okay.
That's very interesting. If anyone else has any questions, please raise your hand, but I have many more as well. I have a question around the collaboration and the relationship you have with the health services and the universities, and how, as a medical research institute, you balance those relationships.
Yes, so as an independent medical research institute, we have to have an affiliation with a university, because that's the way that we're able to get academic titles. It's the way that we can have high degree students and the like. From the university perspective, they like it because they can claim credit for all of the outputs and the grants that we raise. So it's a pretty good symbiotic relationship. Finding the right university is I think a challenge, and negotiating the right deal. But we're very, very happy where we are with UNSW. We've got a really good relationship there. The health districts, we don't have, in my view, anywhere near as strong a relationship with them as we should have, and I think the universities have moderately functional relationships, or certainly our own university has a moderately functional relationship with the health districts, and pretty weak relationships, I think, with the primary healthcare networks. Those, I think, could be strengthened a lot. I think the challenge is always that the local health districts are poor, and they're really focused on delivering care, and they all have a commitment to research, and they all genuinely want to do more research, but it's very easy for it to get sidelined because of clinical pressures. One of the things that I'm going to be really focused on over the next few years, and we're just relocating our institute actually to a more clinical setting. And one of the things I'm really excited about is the opportunity to sit down with senior leadership from the local health district and also the primary healthcare network and really try to figure out how can we take some of the learnings about embedding clinical trials into the health system, which I think the UK probably would be the best example of. I mean, it's an imperfect example, but it's the best example currently. How could we do that? And could we trial that perhaps in in one local health district with a willing CEO to see how that might work in Australia?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And regarding rural and remote, what do you see challenges? Because we like starting up as a research unit, very small, wanting to keep focus so that we provide quality, and having that collaboration. Where do you see clinical trials and trials going in rural and remote in the future? And what needs to be done to grow this area?
Yeah. So for the sorts of we do a lot of trials that are we do lots of sort of hyperacute type studies in hospitals, which are pretty intensive, and I think they present real challenges. But I think that there are a lot of trials which we do, which are maybe in secondary prevention in diabetes or coronary disease, or other non-acute settings where there are, with the technologies available now, there are great opportunities to involve rural, regional, remote communities and sites. And again, I think what we need is fora where we can have all the relevant parties, the local health district, the local research teams, maybe the remote research teams at MRIs or universities in some of the major centres, get together and figure out. It's really just the basic operational things around how do we actually hire staff? How do we contact patients? How do we enthuse people about doing this? How do we get consumer community buy-in to this? These are not tricky, technical, academically difficult things to do, but they are really difficult to do because we don't have the places where we come together on a regular basis to solve for how to resolve these pretty basic operational problems. So I think that's where the solution lies.
Sounds like we've got a plan then.
Yeah, look, and I'd be really keen to, not just give this presentation, but actually to follow up with you, Amy, and talk about how and that was certainly, I think, why Paul invited me, was to think about how we, perhaps we, George and Race, could actually get together in the longer term.
Yeah, and also ensure we approach it on a national level as opposed to within each individual state, because otherwise I think we're just contributing to the to the growing case studies around and not the actual national data linkage or the data platform that we need to compete with the rest of the world.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. There are far too many things that are sort of solved on a one-to-one basis for one particular project at one time and then evaporate straight after.